My name's Logan, and I'm 52 years old. I run a small used car dealership, a business I built from the ground up. Back when I started, I didn't have much to my name, just a few $1,000 saved from years of working in my dad's modest garage. He passed away when I was barely out of high school, leaving me with what little he had managed to scrape together. It wasn't much, but I held on to it and used it to start something of my own. For years, I pulled double shifts, pinched every penny I could, and slowly transformed an empty lot into a proper dealership. I've never been wealthy, and I don't live in some big fancy house, but I've never felt the need for that. I'm a straightforward kind of guy. Folks around here know me, and they trust me, and honestly, that means more to me than any luxury car or corner office ever could. And then there's Amanda, my wife of 25 years. We first met at a holiday party a friend of mine threw years ago, one of those social events I usually tried to avoid, but my buddy insisted I tag along. She was there with her friends, in the middle of her second year of law school. Right from the start, I could tell she wasn't like anyone else I'd met, driven, smart, and beautiful in a way that turned heads. I found out she'd been raised by her grandmother after her parents died in an accident when she was still a kid. Then, while Amanda was in college, her grandmother passed away too, leaving her to navigate life on her own. I could see the weight of all that loss on her, even though she carried it gracefully. That night, we hit it off and ended up talking for hours about everything, our struggles, our ambitions, our hopes for the future. She had big dreams, and honestly, I couldn't believe someone like her would even give me a second glance. But we connected in a way that just felt right. After dating for a while, she hinted she was ready to take the next step. I picked up on it, got her a ring, and popped the question not long after. She said yes, and together, we built a life. It wasn't a fairy tale romance, but it was real and solid. I worked extra hours to support her through law school, covering tuition and whatever living expenses she couldn't handle on her own. Eventually, she landed a junior position at a small law firm, and over time, she climbed the ladder while I kept growing the dealership. We raised 2 sons, Ethan and Tyler, who are both grown now and off carving their own paths. For 25 years, I thought we had it all figured out. I'm not saying it was fireworks every day, but I believed we had built something solid, a partnership rooted in trust and hard work. To me, that's what marriage is all about, being steady and dependable for each other. Or at least, that's what I thought it was. Then, last year, Amanda got a job offer from a prestigious law firm downtown. It was a big deal, better pay, a flashier title, and one of those sleek offices up in a high-rise with a killer view of the city. She was ecstatic about it. Her new boss, Nathan, was a well-known attorney with a reputation for winning high-stakes cases. He was the kind of guy who thrived in the spotlight, someone who loved seeing his face on billboards and in the headlines. Amanda couldn't stop talking about him. At first, she'd go on about how brilliant he was, how ambitious, and how much she was learning under his leadership. I didn't think too much of it. I figured she just respected the guy. After all, we'd been together for over 2 decades. I had no reason to doubt her. But then, little things started shifting. At first, it was so subtle, I might have missed it if I weren't paying close attention. She began dressing sharper, wearing outfits that looked more refined and definitely more expensive. Occasionally, she'd come home with a faint trace of cologne that wasn't mine. When I'd ask about her day, her answers felt dismissive, like she didn't think I needed to know. Then her hours started stretching longer. More late nights at the office, more weekend work events, and I began noticing her texting a lot, always with this sly little smile, like she was sharing a private joke I wasn't part of. Then she started taking her phone calls in private, slipping out of the room and dropping her voice to barely a whisper. Now, I'm not the type to leap to conclusions, and jealousy isn't really in my nature, but after spending over 2 decades with someone, you develop a sense for when something's not right. You don't need flashing lights to tell you when the rhythm of your life has shifted. Still, I kept my mouth shut, hoping that whatever this was, it would blow over. I wanted to trust her. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became that something wasn't adding up. It was like she'd stopped caring if I noticed. The weeks crawled by, and the weight of it all finally reached a tipping point. One night, after yet another late return from some work event, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. I waited until she came in, and then I sat her down. Calmly, without raising my voice or throwing accusations, I asked her point-blank if there was something she needed to tell me. At first, she seemed caught off guard, like she hadn't expected me to ask. She stammered, offering up a string of weak excuses, but I didn't back down. I kept pushing for the truth, and after what felt like an endless back and forth, she finally admitted it. Her tone was so casual, it made my stomach turn. She looked at me as if she were telling me she forgot to take out the trash, not confessing that she'd been sleeping with another man. She was seeing someone. That's how she put it. I asked her who, and after a long pause, she finally said his name, Nathan. Her almighty boss, the one she'd been raving about for months. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just dropped his name like it was nothing. The silence between us was suffocating, but apparently, she wasn't finished. It was like she decided to unload everything she'd been holding back. She told me she needed someone who was her equal, someone ambitious, someone who matched her standards. In her eyes, I hadn't grown at all over the years. According to her, I was stuck, too predictable, too content with a simple life. She, on the other hand, wanted more. She deserved more. Then she said something I'll never forget. She called Nathan an alpha. That's the word she used. The way she said it, it sounded rehearsed, like she was reciting a line he'd fed her himself. She kept going, her voice steady like she was explaining a simple fact I just wasn't smart enough to grasp. Nathan, she said, was everything I wasn't. He was polished, sophisticated, the kind of man who looked important and could provide her with the finer things in life. She glanced at me as she said this, her eyes flicking over my work clothes, like they embarrassed her. Nathan, she continued, was a real man. Someone who understood her ambition, who was clean-cut, successful, and driven. That's what she deserved, she said. I sat there, stunned, listening to my wife of 25 years reduce everything I'd done, my loyalty, my hard work, the life I'd built for her and our family, to nothing more than mediocrity. In her eyes, I was just some small-town guy running a small business, and that wasn't enough for her anymore. And then she dropped what she must have thought was the grand finale. She had a solution, she said. We could stay married for appearances. Meanwhile, she'd keep seeing Nathan, and I'd just have to deal with it. She even called it an arrangement, as if we were negotiating a business deal. Oh, and apparently, Nathan was totally on board with this plan. If you can't handle it, she added, her voice calm but laced with thinly veiled smugness, Nathan has a team of 20 lawyers who'll make sure you lose everything. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like she was offering friendly advice and looking out for my best interests. I stared at her for a long moment, then looked her straight in the eye and said, "Good luck." I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't let her see how much her words had gutted me. I just stood up, left the room, and went upstairs without another word. She stayed sitting there, stunned, clearly not expecting that kind of reaction. Maybe she thought I'd beg or plead, but I wasn't about to lower myself for someone who'd thrown our marriage in the dirt. As far as I was concerned, I'd said everything that needed to be said. She must have called him the moment I left the room. Her voice was hushed, carrying a slight tremble, like she was trying to hold her emotions together. "Yes, Nathan," she said. I told him everything. No, I didn't bother lying. I told him the truth, that I deserve more, that I need someone like you. A real man. There was a pause, and then I heard his voice faintly through the line. Even muffled, it oozed arrogance. You told him what we agreed on, right? That he's lucky to have had you for this long. That he hasn't exactly been satisfying you. Yes, she answered, though there was a slight hesitation in her tone. But it hurt, you know. 25 years is a long time. Logan's been a good man, he supported me through school, took care of everything, raised our kids. When he reminded me of all that, I couldn't help but feel guilty. Nathan cut her off, his tone dismissive. Guilty? Come on, Amanda. That guy's a joke. He's a small-town mechanic who's never been able to give you what you need. He's boring, stuck in the past. You deserve an alpha, a man who can truly take care of you. You're right, she said, her voice a little firmer, though there was still an edge of conflict there. I told him all that, but he barely reacted, just told me good luck and walked away. Nathan laughed, the sound grating. He'll have to get used to the arrangement, Amanda. Guys like him, they learn their place eventually. I stayed where I was, silent, listening from the other room. My blood was boiling, but I kept myself in check. There was no point in confronting her again, not when she'd already made her choice so clear. The next morning, I left the house early and headed to work. I wasn't about to sit around for more of her excuses or endure the pitying glances she'd started throwing my way, like I was some clueless fool. By noon, I was on the lot, sorting through a new shipment of cars, when Nathan showed up. He strode into my office like he owned the place, decked out in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire monthly expenses. Without so much as a knock or a, "May I?" he dropped into the chair across from me, smirking like he'd just conquered a kingdom. "Logan," he began, his voice smooth and dripping with fake sincerity, "I think it's time we had a man-to-man talk." I could already tell this wasn't going to be pleasant. He launched into his spiel, rambling about his vision for the situation, as if he were presenting some groundbreaking business proposal instead of tearing apart my marriage. He spoke like he was doing me a favor, offering pearls of wisdom from the high perch he imagined himself on. He went on about how he and Amanda had a deeper connection, how they were equals in a way she and I could never be, and how he could provide for her in ways I never could. Then he leaned forward, locking eyes with me, and delivered the kicker with a smug little grin. "You're a good guy, Logan, but men like me, we lead. We know how to handle things." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, clearly enjoying the sound of his own voice, before leaning in closer and adding, "She wants to be with a real alpha. A man who knows how to take charge." My blood was boiling, but I kept my expression neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I stayed quiet, letting him dig his own grave. But Nathan wasn't done yet. He pulled out a thick stack of papers from his briefcase, laid them on my desk, and gave them a condescending tap. "Here's the deal," he said, flashing me a smile that made my skin crawl. "Divorce papers, restraining orders, the whole package. Amanda's already signed everything, by the way." He paused, his smirk widening as if this moment were the highlight of his day. "It's best for everyone if you just sign the papers and keep this civil," he went on, his tone dripping with condescension. "Let's not make this ugly, Logan. There's no need for you to be that guy who can't accept reality." Then he leaned in closer, lowering his voice to almost a whisper. "Besides," he added, feigning sympathy, "this way you can keep whatever shred of dignity you've got left. Amanda's still willing to let you stick around, play the loyal companion on weekends. It's not like she's cutting you off completely. So do the smart thing, Logan. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I stayed quiet, letting him ramble on, giving him just enough silence to make him think he was in control. He clearly fed off it, sitting there with that patronizing smirk plastered across his face, a look I figured he'd probably practiced in the mirror his whole life. Finally, I stood up. Slowly, deliberately, I took a step toward him. Before he could even process what was coming, I drove my fist straight into his smug face. The satisfying crunch of bone under my knuckles echoed in the room as he staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face. Blood started to stream from his nose, dripping onto his expensive suit. He stumbled, clutching at his face, his eyes wide, like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. That, I said, my voice cold and steady, was just the beginning. Before he could recover, I grabbed him by the collar and delivered a solid uppercut to his gut. The air rushed out of him in a choked gasp, and he doubled over, clutching his stomach as he crumpled to the floor. I crouched down beside him, making sure he could see the fury in my eyes. "Let me teach you something about what a real man is," I said, my voice low but sharp as a knife. "A real man doesn't need to swagger into someone else's life and throw his weight around to feel important. He doesn't walk into another man's space, try to steal his family, and call himself an alpha. A real man stands by his word, by his family, and by what he's built, things you wouldn't understand if they hit you in the face. Though maybe now you do." He squirmed on the floor, his face contorted in pain, but I didn't let up. I stood, giving him just enough time to think the worst was over, then pressed my boot down hard on his outstretched hand. The bones cracked beneath my weight, and he let out a howl of pain, trying to yank his hand back, but I held firm. "And one more thing," I said, staring him down as he writhed. "If you think you're walking out of here to call the cops, go ahead. Maybe I'll spend a few years behind bars, but when I get out, we'll have this conversation again. Only next time, I'll make sure it's a lot less pleasant for you." For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. It was like he finally understood that his threats, his power, and that expensive suit of his meant absolutely nothing in this moment. He wasn't in control anymore, and it was clear he'd never imagined facing consequences like this from someone he thought was beneath him. "Now get up," I said, stepping back, watching as he struggled to his feet. He cradled his shattered hand against his chest, blood dripping from his nose, his face pale with humiliation and pain. He didn't wait for me to tell him twice. He staggered toward the door, broken and defeated, without so much as a backward glance. I watched him go, then shut the door behind him. For the first time in days, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface began to subside, leaving behind a strange, quiet calm. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Later that afternoon, Amanda called Nathan. "Nathan, I thought you'd be back hours ago." "Where are you?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety, edged with a hint of fear. On the other end, Nathan sounded groggy, his words slurred and muffled. "I'm at the hospital," he muttered. "I've been here for hours. Logan messed me up bad." "What?" Amanda gasped, her disbelief palpable. "What happened? Were you in an accident?" "No," Nathan replied, bitterness dripping from his tone. "I went to talk to him, like we planned. He broke my nose, my right hand, a couple of ribs, and I think even my cheekbone." His voice wavered, a tremor betraying his usual arrogance. Amanda was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. "I don't believe it," she said finally, her voice soft with shock. "Logan's never been violent. That's not who he is." Nathan let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Believe it. I've got the X-rays to prove it. Your husband isn't as gentle as you thought." Amanda's tone shifted, becoming almost pleading. "Is there any way you can avoid going to the police? Logan doesn't deserve to go to prison over this." Nathan let out a long, heavy sigh. "The cops have already been here, Amanda. But I told them it was a hit and run. Logan warned me if I pressed charges, he'd make me regret it tenfold when he got out. I'm not looking to test him on that." Another silence stretched between them before Amanda spoke again, her voice trembling. "I can't believe this. Not my Logan." Nathan's voice turned sharp, full of resentment. "You didn't see his face, Amanda. The way he looked at me while he was beating me up, you wouldn't recognize him either. He said this was just the beginning if I didn't back off. I'm not taking any more risks with him." Amanda tried to steady her voice, but the desperation seeped through. "So that's it? After everything, you're just giving up?" Nathan didn't answer right away, and when he finally did, his tone was flat and final. I don't have a choice. I'm doing what I need to survive. The line clicked, leaving Amanda sitting in stunned silence. The reality of the situation crashed down around her. Everything she had gambled on, her so-called upgrade, had just collapsed into a pile of rubble. The next day, Amanda showed up at the hospital. She looked disheveled, her hair tied back hastily, with dark circles shadowing her eyes. She found Nathan in a recovery room, propped up in bed with his arm in a cast and his face a patchwork of bruises and swelling. Nathan glanced up as she entered, irritation flickering briefly in his battered expression. Nathan, she began, her voice tight with tension, you have to help me. I drove around until 8 last night. I didn't know if it was safe to go home. I tried calling Logan, but he wouldn't answer. When I finally worked up the nerve to go back, I couldn't get in. The locks were changed. Nathan stared at her, his patience clearly wearing thin as she continued. I spent the night at a friend's place, she said hurriedly. This morning, I checked our bank accounts, they're empty. My credit cards don't work either. You've got to help me. Can you get one of the attorneys at work to file for divorce and get Logan out of the house? Nathan's face hardened as he considered her request. After a long pause, he shook his head. No, he said firmly. No to all of that. Amanda blinked, stunned. What? What do you mean, no? Nathan let out a bitter sigh, his frustration evident. If I use company resources or get involved, it'll just give Logan more reasons to come after me. Frankly, I'm not willing to take that risk. He shifted in bed, wincing at the pain. I'll give you 4 extra weeks of severance pay, Amanda, but that's it. Pack your things, leave today, and if Logan asks, tell him you were fired. That's all I can do for you. His words hung in the air like a lead weight, and Amanda stood frozen, trying to process what little support she had left crumbling beneath her. She stared at him, her mouth slightly open, struggling to process what she'd just heard. Didn't you hear me? Logan wiped me out. I've got no money, no job, and now you're telling me you won't even help. Nathan's face remained hard, utterly unapologetic. I'm sorry, Amanda. But you didn't see the look in your husband's eyes when he went after me. He's 10 times the man I am in that department, and honestly, I don't need a cheating wife complicating my life. This is where it ends for us. Her expression shifted, anger replacing disbelief as she narrowed her eyes at him. You're pathetic, you know that. Yesterday, you were strutting around, bragging about being an alpha male. And today? You're cowering like a scared little boy, afraid my husband is hiding under your bed. She paused, her voice dropping into a scornful whisper. How did I ever think trading up meant ending up with someone like you? And for the record, you're delusional if you ever thought I took you seriously. Nathan's eyes flickered with a mix of embarrassment and frustration, but he didn't respond. She spun on her heel and stormed out without looking back, leaving him bruised, broken, and utterly defeated. Later that day, Amanda sat alone in her car on the side of the road, her phone in hand as she checked her accounts again. Every credit card had been declined, and she was down to her last bit of cash. She knew her gas wouldn't last much longer either. I'd made sure she had no lifelines left. Was it harsh? Maybe. I figured she was heading toward our sons, Ethan and Tyler, hoping they'd take her in. They'd always been quick to respond to her calls, rarely letting much time pass before replying. But now, as she stared at her phone, the silence was deafening. Amanda sighed, set the phone down, and got out of the car. Straightening her skirt, she stepped to the roadside and stuck out her thumb, hoping for a ride. After a few minutes, a familiar beat-up van approached. As I pulled up next to her, she froze, her eyes wide with panic and disbelief as she recognized me behind the wheel. I stepped out and gestured toward the passenger seat. We need to talk, I said calmly. She hesitated, her gaze darting between me and the road, but eventually, she climbed in. She looked worn down, the events of the past few days etched deeply into her face. I didn't waste time. "Here's how this is going to go," I began, my tone firm. "You're going to file for divorce. There'll be no alimony, no claims to my assets. What's mine stays mine. What's yours, well, good luck with that. Any jewelry I bought you? You'll return it. You can put whatever reason you want on the paperwork. I don't care, as long as you're out of my life." I let the weight of my words hang in the air before continuing. "Once the divorce is finalized, you're leaving town and not looking back. You can reach out to our kids if they want to talk, but only on their terms and never when I'm around. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., your belongings will be packed and ready for pickup. If they're not gone by 11 o'clock, they'll be burned. Am I clear?" She nodded, her face pale, her eyes darting toward the floor. "When can I expect the papers?" I asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "It'll take about a week." "You've got 5 days," I replied flatly. She nodded again, her gaze distant, as if she were staring at the wreckage of the life she'd destroyed. I looked at her for a moment longer, then motioned for her to get out. She stepped out of the van without a word, and I drove away, not sparing her a second glance. The next morning, at 10:30, she showed up to collect her things. 5 days later, the divorce papers were on my desk. The reason she'd listed? Irreconcilable differences. I couldn't help but laugh. A few months later, it was all finalized. I was free. Do I have regrets? A few, maybe. I regret that Amanda never understood what loyalty means. I regret that she decided I wasn't good enough for the image she wanted to project. And I'm certain she never grasped the gamble she was taking by trying to undermine a man who stands firm in what he's built. Could I have tried to save our marriage? Perhaps, if she hadn't threatened me, belittled me, and treated me like a roadblock in her new life. But she made her choice, and that was the point of no return. Now, I move forward, alone. Maybe I'll end up dying that way too. But I'd rather face life on my terms than spend one more minute with someone who didn't value respect and loyalty.